The Legend of Zelda released in North America on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987, and at the time there was really nothing else like it. There had been fairly simple adventure-style games before, most notably Adventure on the Atari, but that was noticeably simpler. More of a proof of concept trying to bring tabletop RPGs to life. Zelda, on the other hand, introduced an open overworld full of secrets and interactive objects, as well as a fairly non-linear progression style where dungeons could be completed in almost any order, and items received opened up new pathways and secrets. Looking back, it was all still very simple, without much in the way of puzzle solving or complex combat. But for the NES, with its 4 buttons and a D-pad, there was a lot of substance thanks to a robust inventory system and multiple quests that change up the dungeon layout and level of difficulty. Zelda also holds a special place in my heart as the first game I really connected with as a kid. I remember watching my aunt basically speedrun the game, complete it, and move right on to the second quest. I might be remembering it more impressively than it was, but it blew my mind as a kid how good she was at that game. I never enjoyed playing it as much as I did watching her. The stiff 4-directional movement and wimpy forward stabs with the sword made navigating and attacking needlessly difficult, and the close hitboxes led me to a lot of deaths. I do have an old full Let's Play of the game if you want to see my poor gameplay in action, but the point is I still respect the crap out of the game and its legacy. Even though I don't have the passion for playing the game again, no Zelda series retrospective could be complete without starting from the beginning. This video isn't so much critiquing the game itself though. It's looking at how its legacy has impacted the rest of the series, even up to the most recent reimagining of the series that began with Breath of the Wild and continued into Tears of the Kingdom. So, let's look at The Legend of Zelda. As I said, this first game has kept a strong hold on the rest of the series, which makes sense because it set all the groundwork. As far as the items, they fit into the categories of attack, defend, and exploration. Some items are context sensitive, like how the candle can light dark rooms but also burn bushes and hurt enemies that come into contact with it, while other items are used automatically and don't need to be equipped, like the raft activating when you reach a dock, or the power bracelet letting you move blocks that wouldn't move before. Attack items are more situational, with the boomerang being totally optional but upgradable, the bow and arrow being a powerful ranged attack but with very limited ammo, and your sword starting pretty weak but being able to find more powerful ones hidden around the world. Outside of just using a lot of the same items, most Zelda games also follow the same story structure. Your hero, canonically named Link, acquires a sword and shield as well as a slew of other progression items throughout the game, from shops, secrets, and dungeons, and then explores the map searching for upgrades and dungeons to complete whatever MacGuffin fetch quest that game decides to throw at you. For Zelda 1, it's as simple as it gets, with the evil pig lord Ganon separating the legendary Triforce, kidnapping Princess Zelda, and dousing the world in darkness. So Link has to defeat his minions and collect all the pieces of the Triforce, as well as the magical Sword of Legend and the Silver Arrows, in order to even hurt Ganon, much less kill him. This is obviously a rough summary, as the story is almost entirely relegated to the instruction manual, as is true of most NES games. Though the intro of this game does lay out a bit more information, including some surprisingly spoilery looks at various items you'll receive in the game. I guess it makes sense, there was little to no explanation in games back then, so without some information on what items do, it can be hard to understand what you even just received. Now we have the internet, so secrets can be a little more secret for those that want to go in without spoilers, while others can look things up at their leisure. But if you look at the groundwork laid there, that structure stayed around for many years. Sometimes the Triforce stays together, but Link has to collect some other series of things in order to reach Ganon, but he almost always needs the Master Sword and light arrows still, even if they're sometimes kept by Zelda rather than being something Link actually obtains. Zelda 1 has 8 pieces of Triforce stored across 8 dungeons, and then the final 9th dungeon that houses the fight with Ganon, whereas future games would have somewhere between 4 to 10 dungeons, with some considered more mini dungeons because you don't get a proper progression object from them, or maybe they don't have a full-on boss fight at the end, that kind of thing. But while stories and progression would evolve and get more complex on better hardware, they've rarely deviated from the structure even nearly 40 years later. Sure, Breath of the Wild was a pretty drastic reimagining of the Zelda formula, but developers discussed prior to launch how they actually went back to Zelda 1 as inspiration for how the world map is laid out in a more open, non-linear manner, so you could argue that the reimagining actually brought the series back to its roots, after it had gotten kind of muddied with more segmented linear games like Skyward Sword. I actually love the behind-the-scenes looks at creation of Breath of the Wild, because they showed how the actual game started in a modified Zelda 1 engine while they were still workshopping the game and creating the basics of its physics system. But we'll get back to that later, I just think it's really cool. Anyway, the point is, the bones of this game are still going strong to this day. A lot of the staple items have even carried on through every game since, like the bow and arrow, the bombs, boomerang, some kind of torch, a method of teleporting, the list goes on. The dungeons themselves have evolved, but stayed largely consistent as well. The dungeons in Zelda 1 are admittedly very simple, with a series of blocky rooms full of enemies and obstacles, and occasionally a block to push to open access somewhere, or a bomb wall to destroy for a secret shortcut. Each dungeon also includes a dungeon item that's sometimes required to finish the dungeon, like needing to use the ladder to cross impassable tiles of water. Dungeons are over when you defeat the usually simple boss fight that almost always just consists of dodging attacks and slashing at a weak point, and then picking up the Triforce piece and getting teleported out. Later games would at least make dungeons look thematically different, usually starting with a pretty easy tutorial dungeon, and then elementally theming the rest based on where they are, so a forest temple, fire temple, desert temple, etc. Zelda 1 generally uses the same exact tile sets with occasionally reskinned colors, but there's no perceptible theme despite one being inside a tree, one in a mountain temple, etc. This is largely due to system limitations, as Zelda 1 was still quite a bit more advanced than most NES games. Repetitive-looking dungeon tiles and an overworld map that can be hard to decipher due to many screens looking the same is just par for the course with a game this big and involved on an 8-bit system that can only store so many assets on its cartridge. Especially with this being one of the few games at the time that put the extra money into a battery-based save system. Anyone remember the story of how the clouds and bushes in Mario 1 are the same sprite? Yeah, these games were all about efficient asset management, so I'll take it. That being said, a big part of why I struggle going back to this game has nothing to do with the map layout or samey-looking dungeons. It's just the dated way it plays. I even think the simplified graphics have a retro charm to them and wouldn't want to change them. Over the years, there's been a few re-releases of the game, like BS Zelda, as well as fan ROM hacks that focus on some quality of life improvements and better graphics, like the Zelda Remastered project on the Messen HD emulator, but those still just feel like a paint job and don't even look right in some cases, with assets that are ripped from other games and feel out of place in this world. What would improve the game for me is a fairly faithful remake that just makes Link feel better to control. 8-directional movement would be huge, but even just improving the walking speed a bit and increasing the hit range on sword swipes would still be acceptable. That's when I found The Legend of Zelda Redux. Loyal viewers might remember I talked about a Redux mod in the past with my Super Metroid retrospective, and that made such a big difference in modern playability without actually impacting the graphical presentations of one of my favorite games. Well, Zelda Redux provides a similar quality of life polish on this classic Nintendo game. It provides a few small changes like increasing the cap on rupees, bombs, and more, while also giving you a more detailed overworld minimap. The biggest update though is changing Link's sword to a horizontal slash akin to Link's Awakening. There's an optional mod that makes it a full body slash like Link to the Past, but I didn't want to break the game, I just wanted it to be a little more accessible. It also adds cracks to where vulnerable walls are, which takes out a lot of guesswork and memorization from the original game, where you'd waste all your bombs hoping there's a secret somewhere, and then not having any when you actually need them. And since some dungeons have required paths through bomb walls, this never felt terribly well balanced, so it's a pretty big change too. It's just one of those strange development decisions where they should have asked, first game in a new franchise, how obtuse should we make it? Like, no one knows what bombable walls are yet. Maybe don't make them that secret. It's bad enough there's a whole ass dungeon hiding under an innocuous bush in the forest, but at least that one seems slightly obvious with its placement on the map, even if you have to know that the candle can burn bushes first. A smaller thing that I didn't even notice at first was that you can also press select to tab through your item inventory, so you spend a lot less time going into the menu to swap your items out. Anyway, I've buried the lead here. The point is, this ROM hack made the game much better to complete for this video without really substantially changing the look or feel of the game, aside from updating the sprites on a few monsters and that kind of thing. Sometimes it's the little things that make the biggest difference. But now you know why most of my footage looks a little different. It just goes to show how a game can influence its sequels, and then dedicated fans can improve the original based on those sequels. It's a circle of life. I love it. But back to how this game influenced its sequels. A lot of first games in popular franchises feel a little clunky and underbaked in comparison to the rest. Look at the original Mega Man with its 6 bosses and a high score system for some reason. But the improvements are more noticeable when the games come out in close proximity and improve iteratively on each one, like Mega Man, or like the PS2 Ratchet & Clank series, for example. I have a retrospective on those too, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but the point is, the Zelda 1 impact is a little harder to decipher because it was followed up pretty closely with a very different sequel that we will unfortunately have to cover next. I don't like that game, so I'm not looking forward to it, but even it shares a lot of mechanical similarities. Top-down overworld map, sword and shield based combat, dungeons to complete with bosses and items or magic powers, and each one that help explore the world around you. Except it adds a deeper story with populated towns, similar to Castlevania at the time, and more platforming and puzzle-heavy exploration. Link can jump. That's weird enough. But skipping over that for now, we get the next generation of Zelda with Link to the Past, which feels like the next logical evolution and where the series really kicks off. The power of the Super Nintendo allowed for a much more dynamic experience with a story actually told through cutscenes and ample dialogue, as well as more complicated dungeon layouts with proper puzzles and scrolling screens, rather than needing every room to be a TV-shaped square. The items evolved too, with flippers replacing the raft, allowing Link to swim anywhere that's not blocked off, and the hook shot replacing the ladder, where you can attach to points across the room, not just across a single tile. And side quests littered the world that rewarded you with rupees, optional power-ups, and heart pieces. Gone are the days of missing out on full hearts because you chose the wrong thing in a shop. Again, why would they even do that? NES games were mean. Link to the Past, especially at the time of its release, felt like the game they wanted to make without system limitations. The fact that they would also release BS Zelda, a sort of 16-bit remake of the first game, proves the potential they saw for Zelda on this system. Even if BS Zelda was a very limited Japan-only release as a timed satellite title that very few people got to play at that time. BS indeed. Though even emulating it right now, it's nothing special. I'd just stick with Link to the Past. We would get one more Zelda game though, before the first major series shift on 3D hardware. Link's Awakening for the Game Boy felt much closer in scope to the original game. Partially because of the similar button layout between the Game Boy and NES, but also because they're both 8-bit systems. So the fact that Link's Awakening plays closer to Link to the Past is extremely impressive for its hardware. We'll delve more into the GameCube titles later, and just talk generally about how impressive that system was when it came to porting or downgrading SNES titles, but Link's Awakening specifically felt very ahead of its time. Made even more clear when it was remade for the Switch and felt like it belonged on modern hardware, like it hadn't even skipped a beat. Really, the only thing holding that game back is the number of buttons, because after Link to the Past, going back to regularly swapping items on A and B from the menu felt slow and clunky. But the game uses a similar map structure to Zelda 1 with a screen-sized grid of squares, and uses that to make a much more fleshed out and dynamic world. It also has some of the best dungeons, of the whole series. Like the Eagle's Tower, where you have to carry wrecking balls to various pillars around the dungeon and destroy them, knocking down parts of the tower to give you access to the top. This kind of dynamic level design, where objects carried across rooms to complete puzzles in other areas, was a huge step forward for the series, especially compared to the mostly simple, single-screen block-pushing puzzles in Link to the Past, a game made on more powerful hardware. Link's Awakening really felt like the logical evolution of Zelda 1. I'd call it the real Zelda 2 as far as its control scheme and graphics, but in a lot of ways it's even more advanced in progression structure than Link to the Past was, so it's this weird thing displaced from time. Though it is Zelda 4, so it is technically a sequel to Link to the Past. But then they re-released it in color with an extra dungeon and some other new mechanics, and it shined even brighter. I think it just reinforces the idea that hardware doesn't really limit innovation. Good developers will find a way to make the game they want to make on the hardware they're given. And I think Link's Awakening is what came from the developers seeing nearly 10 years of series advancement, as well as a number of Zelda knockoff games from their competitors, and realizing they could do a lot more within the same hardware and button limitations. It's almost like Zelda 1 was a proof of concept for what this game could be. The series would continue to evolve, of course, with the first foray into 3D revolutionizing the series again and putting it in the hands of a whole new audience of gamers that missed early systems and were just now coming into the N64, and the 2D games would continue as well with the Oracle games, spiritual sequels to Link's Awakening that took the color gimmicks to a whole new level in a way not possible on the original Game Boy, but we'll cover all of those later in the retrospective. The influence of Zelda 1 wouldn't really be directly related to again until close to the release of Breath of the Wild. Technically, Hyrule Warriors was also influenced with its adventure mode map, but that's a spin-off, we're not counting it. I just think the way it used those art assets was pretty cool. But yeah, after years of a pretty stable 3D Zelda structure based on Ocarina of Time, Nintendo decided to reinvent Zelda again for modern audiences. And for that, they surprisingly went back to where it all started. At GDC 2017, Nintendo hosted a panel showing off their Breath of the Wild prototype, based on Zelda 1, but with modern mechanics like a simple physics system and destructive elements from the actual Breath of the Wild game. It was just a basic overworld with some classic enemies and a few environmental puzzles, but it served as their early inspiration for how they wanted a new style of Zelda game to be. And to me, this is what makes the evolution of the Zelda series interesting. The most recent titles are still looking to the beginning for inspiration. Modern Zelda is so far removed from its NES roots hardware-wise, but the gameplay has stayed fairly true to it. The Hyrule featured in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom can easily be broken down into square chunks, and especially in Tears of the Kingdom, you can just accidentally stumble across most of the dungeons, even if you can't complete them without following the prerequisites first. Obviously, some major changes have happened over the years, like more advanced combat maneuvers, better enemy AI, dynamic side quests, and interactive characters and towns and stuff, but one of the key changes in Breath of the Wild was the concept of doing things at your own pace, in your own order. And that is fundamentally taken from Zelda 1. That sense of discovery. The world doesn't really tell you where to go, it's up to you to figure out what you can do and when. Sure, there's more descriptive text, walls give you clues that they're destructive, and exploration is much more involved with complex puzzles and more item integration, but I think the GDC presentation does a great job at showing how the NES prototype gels with the actual final game.
A game where the user can think and decide on their own where they want to go and what they want to do and experience excitement and adventure. I thought to myself, maybe what I need to do to create such a game is to go back to the essence.
Similarly, I think if there was ever to be a fully 3D remake of Zelda 1, akin to Final Fantasy VII Remake, that it would feel inspired by Breath of the Wild because, again, that's the circle of life. But it would also feel like a totally new game, again, like Final Fantasy VII Remake, because you'd have to fundamentally change the game for the new perspective. If dungeons were just a series of screens with enemies, that wouldn't be interesting to new players. Well, I guess hack and slash players, but that's not really Zelda. But if you drastically change the layouts and make each dungeon more unique, it won't feel like the same game anymore. That's why this is a tough game to look back at. It's honestly incredible how much has stayed the same with this series over the years, but it's also unfortunate how simple this first game is because it wouldn't really be a viable candidate for a remake that modern audiences could enjoy. It would almost have to be like A Link Between Worlds, which started as a 3D remake of Link to the Past, but ended up being its own game with some shared elements. Like a remake sequel. You could almost say that Breath of the Wild is a remake sequel to Zelda 1 in that case, but I wouldn't because they're still pretty drastically different. And I wish Breath of the Wild had more dungeons, so. But in conclusion, Zelda 1 still deserves so much credit for laying the groundwork, even if the game itself doesn't really hold up anymore. There's ways to make it work, but it's not a perfect experience. Outside of nostalgia, that is. Some people would say it's perfect. I will always remember it fondly, but I don't necessarily need to ever play it again. Which is more than I can say for Zelda 2, but we'll get there next time. Until then, I've been Zero Score, and this is my Zelda retrospective, years in the making. Sorry it took so long, but I hope you're along for the ride. Every game is going to be covered a little differently. You can find countless beat-by-beat retrospectives around the internet. I want to do it my way. Like for the next one, I might bring some guests along. Talk to you soon.